What do Toru Dutt, R.K. Narayan, Kamla Das and Arundhati Roy have in common? Sure, they are all Indian English authors, but they didn't just write in English. They wrote as Indians for Indians about India at different points in history. But when did Indian English literature really begin? And how do you remember what came when, especially for your NET exam? Let's simplify that once and for all. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Riya Gandhi, and if you are preparing for your UGC NET English exam, then this video is going to be your go-to timeline for understanding Indian English literature, a very important topic for paper 2. But before we dive into understanding the authors, the movements, and some of the most frequently asked works in this particular exam, understand one thing. Indian English literature is not just literature written in English. It's a record of how we as Indians expressed our identities, our cultures, our struggles, our faith, our histories, and resistance in a colonial language. So when we are talking about Indian English literature or Indian writing in English, it refers to this whole body of literary works that are written in English by authors who have Indian origin, or basically the Indian authors, right? Understand one thing, guys, that Indian English literature is different from Anglo-Indian literature. What is Anglo-Indian literature? Anglo-Indian literature basically refers to literature written about India by British or Western authors. That is Anglo-Indian literature. But what we are concerned with right now is Indian English literature or Indian writing in English. Now, having cleared the basics, the fundamentals, let's move on to understanding some of the most important authors in Indian English literature period-wise. The first period that we are going to discuss in this video is the late 18th century to early 19th century, the time when Britishers had just arrived in India, right? So the kind of literature that was produced as a byproduct of the initial cultural exchange is something that we need to look for, right? So first things first, we need to understand the context of this period. First thing is that British rule was expanding in India, right? The Britishers' influence, rather, was expanding in India. The English language was being introduced in schools, the establishment of missionary schools, right? And also understanding the fact that literature in English, right? British literature in English was used to civilize the native population. Now, out of this cultural exchange and the initial influence of Britishers in India led to some of the most diverse kind of literature being produced during this point of time that was pioneered by key figures, right? So who are these key figures? The first major figure is Raja Ram Mohan Roy, whom Rabindranath Tagore called the inaugurator of the modern age in India. Raja Ram Mohan Roy was a reformer, a thinker, and one of the earliest prose writers in English. His essays sort of focus on social reform, women's rights, and religious tolerance. He is popularly known as a founder of the Brahmo Samaj, and his major work that you need to know for UGC NET English exam is his essay, A Defense of Theism, that was published in 1817. The second key figure that you need to know, especially during this period, is one of the radical teachers and also considered to be one of the first Indian English poets of note, and that is Henry Vivian de Rozier. Henry Vivian de Rozier was a son of an Indian Portuguese father and English mother. But at the same time, the kind of poetry that he produced was of very Indian culture, of very Indian taste. The best poem that I can give you an example of, and which is frequently asked in NET exam, is To India, My Native Land. which has that spark of nationalism and romantic idealism. The next key writer that you need to remember for your NET exam is Michael Madhusudan Dutt. He began his career as an Indian English poet, but then later down in his future, he started writing in Bengali. Talking about his writing style, something that you do need to remember is that he did imitate the English writers, the English poets, especially their style of writing in blank verse. Right? The best example that I can give you right now is The Visions of the Past, which was published in 1849. It is written in Miltonic blank verse, and in this particular work, he handles the Christian theme of the temptation and fall and redemption of man. The second period in Indian English literature is basically from 1857 to 1920. To understand the context of this period, you need to do a quick recap of history, right? Because in 1857, if you remember, we had one of the very first revolts against the Britishers, the 1857 revolt, right? Now, after this revolt, the British rule in India sort of tightened. The relationship between Britishers and us, it sort of turned very acrimonious, it turned very bitter. And as a result of which, Indian English literature became even more vigorous in finding out an Indian identity. Right? So earlier, when you look at the poems of Henry Vivian de Rozier, or even for that matter, Michael Madhusudan Dutt, they sort of imitated the writing style of the Britishers, right? But after 1857, post 1857, things started to change. They didn't want to imitate the writing style of the Britishers. They wanted to find out their own identity, Indian identity, and write in that particular style. And this is what we see happening in the works of some of the most important figures during this point of time. So who were these figures? The very first writer that we are going to talk right now is Toru Dutt. Toru Dutt is often considered to be the first women poet to write in English. She died at a very young age, at just the age of 21. But her work sort of represents the paradigm shift that I mentioned previously as well, that came in Indian English literature post 1857, wherein a lot of writers during this point of time wanted to reclaim Indian identity, wanted to find Indian identity. And as a result of it, you find that Toru Dutt's poems, they have a very unique mixture of Indian mythology, Indian legends, right? And one of her most famous poem that you must have come across is Arcazarina Tree, which is again a UGC NET favorite. The second most important figure writing during this point of time was Sri Aurobindo Ghosh. Sri Aurobindo Ghosh is considered to be one of the most important poets, and not just poets of Indian English literature. He is a yogi, a mystic, a seeker, right, who is, especially in terms of Indian English literature, he's popularly known for his work Savitri. Savitri is a huge work. It's his magnum opus. It was published in 1954. It is divided into 12 books, 49 cantos. It's a retelling of the well-known legend of Satyavan and Savitri, wherein Savitri sort of goes to death, right, fights with death to get her husband's soul back, right? So this is the entire story written in a very beautiful manner by Sri Aurobindo Ghosh. The next important writer that we are going to discuss in this video was not just a poet. He was a dramatist, a novelist, a short story writer, a painter, an educationist, nationalist, internationalist, and beyond. And that is Rabindranath Tagore. Rabindranath Tagore was primarily a Bengali writer, right? He not just wrote in Bengali, but he also wrote in English. He did not just write poetry, but he also wrote short stories and plays, right? But he's popularly known today for his work Gitanjali that he originally wrote in Bengali. But he later translated Gitanjali into English, which won him the Nobel Prize in 1913, making him the first non-European laureate. The next important poet writing during this point of time, especially from 1857 to 1920, was Sarojini Naidu. She is popularly known as the Nightingale of India. Talking about her writing style, she was highly influenced by British Romanticism and Persian and the Urdu modes of writing. Therefore, in her works, she has often combined lyricism with patriotism. And this is something that you would often see in works like in the bazaars of Hyderabad, in the weavers, the Indian weavers, right? All of her works are basically combined under this collection called as the sceptered flute, which is divided into 11 subsections. Some of them are folk songs, songs of love and death, songs of the springtime, right? Having said all of this, understand that Naidu's way of writing poetry has influenced a lot of Indian women poets, Indian women writers, right? So, having said that, now let's move on to the next writer of this particular period. Again, very, very important from UGC NET perspective, and that is Bankim Chandra Chatterjee. Why is Bankim Chandra Chatterjee so important from NET perspective? Because he wrote the first novel in English, and that is Raj Mohan's Wife. It was initially serialized in Calcutta Weekly in 1864 and then finally appeared in the complete book form in 1935. It is this tale of this long-suffering wife Matangini at the hands of her husband Raj Mohan. Very, very important from that perspective, guys. So make sure that when you sit down to prepare or revise for Indian English literature in terms of your NET exam, you keep this one thing in mind, that Bankim Chandra Chatterjee was the first Indian English novelist who wrote the first Indian English novel, Raj Mohan's Wife. The next important period that we are going to talk about right now is the 1920 to 1947 period, the period that basically talks about the nationalism and independence movement. Now, this was the most politically charged period. The relationships between us, the Indians, and the Britishers turned completely acrimonious in the sense that the magazines, the weeklies, the poems, everything shouted the same thing: we want independence. Literature too joined forces during that point of time. The freedom struggle sort of gained momentum during this point of time, and so the literature that was produced during this point of time, it had sort of fully realized its identity. Right? The writers during that point of time realized the Indian identity, what they wanted, and so the kind of literature that was produced during this point of time was only asking one main thing, and that was independence. Right? So it talked a lot about struggle, resistance, identity, right? History for that matter. Right? So we need to understand some of the most pioneering figures during this point of time. So starting with non-fiction, we need to definitely talk about Mahatma Gandhi's works. Mahatma Gandhi ji arrived in 1915 in India. In 1920, he launched the first non-cooperation movement. 1930, the civil disobedience movement. Now, during all of this time while he was leading freedom struggles, he was also writing his autobiography, which is popularly called as The Story of My Experiments with Truth, which was published in 2 volumes, right, and translated by Mahadev Desai. Apart from that, he also ran 2 well-known journals like Young India, Harijan. At the same time, his first major work was Hind Swaraj, which appeared in columns in 1909. It was originally written in Gujarati and translated by him in English in 1910. Mahatma Gandhi ji was highly influenced by a lot of writers and texts. For example, he was influenced by the New Testament. He was influenced by Thoreau's essay, Civil Disobedience. He was influenced by Leo Tolstoy. Right? So all of these little details are very important, especially if you look at from the UGC NET perspective. Speaking of the kind of non-fiction that was produced in Indian English literature during this point of time, we also need to talk about Jawaharlal Nehru, the Prime Minister of India for 17 years. He's popularly known for 2 important books. The first one is The Glimpses of World History that was published in 1934. It basically comprises of letters that he wrote to his daughter from prison. It talks about the survey of the world history from the beginnings of civilization to like the 1930s, right? And the second most important work is The Discovery of India, that was published in 1946. In this particular book, he has talked about India's history. He has talked about India's past, starting from India's civilization to independence in 1947. Again, a very, very important work from UGC NET perspective. Apart from non-fiction acquiring a lot of importance in Indian English literature from 1920 to 1947, this was also the period that was ripe for Indian fiction, for Indian English fiction, because we were talking about Indian identities, right? We were talking about our struggles, our resistance, and what better way to express all of those things than to talk about our own cultures, right? And that was exceptionally done by three major fictional writers of Indian English literature, often called as the famous trio of Indian English fiction, the three pillars of Indian English fiction. And who are those? Those are basically R.K. Narayan, Mulkraj Anand, and Raja Rao. When I'm talking about R.K. Narayan, definitely you must have read one of his short stories either in school or at someplace else, and you must have heard about Malgudi Days, right? The way in which he has portrayed small town life, the way that he has established relatability with the readers, right? He has written in a very simple style, but it's so elegant that it sort of remains a model of Indian realism today. Definitely we need to talk about Mulkraj Anand, right? He was a powerful voice for the marginalized. He has talked about Dalits, about laborers, about peasants. Some of his most popular novels include Untouchable and Coolie, which sort of deal with social injustices head on. Next, we also need to talk about Raja Rao. He is popularly known for his novel Kantapura, which sort of combines the Indian way of storytelling. Being the youngest of the trio, Raja Rao in this particular novel talks about the freedom struggle of the 1930s. It is set in a small South Indian village, right? And the protagonist is young Murthy, who is the Gandhian. And the entire narration of this particular novel is extremely beautiful because it's narrated from the perspective of a grandmother. And it sort of talks about this style of grandmother's tales, right? The oral tradition. And so Raja Rao relies on this concept, this idea of oral tradition to reclaim and talk about Indian identity. Again, a very beautiful and a very important thing to do during this point of time. Now, I know that this was a very quick overview over these three writers, over the three pillars of Indian English fiction. They have written a lot more than we have just covered right now. And that is why if you want to know more about them and if you want to understand their works in detail, then you can watch my full-length video on them exclusively, in which I have covered about their works, their writing style, and some of the most frequently asked questions related to them in UGC NET English exam. So after watching this one, make sure you watch this video as well to get a very comprehensive idea about these writers. Now with this, we come to the end of the first part of Indian English literature timeline. Right, we started off this video by discussing the terminology of Indian English literature, and then we started off discussing period by period the major authors, their works, and the kind of significance they hold in this entire trajectory of Indian English literature. We ended off with the independence period. In the next video, which is part 2 of Indian English literature, we are going to begin with understanding partition literature and how it holds so much significance in Indian English literature. And then finally, we will cover the post-independence era and the contemporary era. Very, very important from UGC NET perspective. Meanwhile, if you have any doubts, any queries, or any questions related to Indian English literature, related to UGC NET English exam or literature in general, please feel free to mention it in the comment section below and I'll be very happy to help you. Having said that, if you want to know more about the courses I offer or the classes that I take, you can check out the description box below. All the links are provided in the description box below. If you found the first part informative and helpful, please like, share and subscribe to my channel for more such insights on literature and UGC NET English exam. Thank you so much for watching till the end. See you in part 2.